Ramesh, let me begin with you first. We heard from General VK Singh, where he said that he had to visit Iraq at least 4 times. It was not an easy operation. The government of India did everything that it possibly can. And what we have now seen is essentially the result of the efforts that have been put by the Indian government in coordination with the Iraqi government in getting the bodies of the 38 Indians back.
Indeed, as we just heard, General VK Singh, India's Junior Minister of State for External Affairs, addressing the media in Amritsar shortly after his aircraft landed there. Essentially, much of what he said, Mohammed, is already in the public domain. It's known to the families of the 38 Indians killed in Iraq and also the country as a whole. But just to recap for the benefit of viewers who might just be tuning in, he says information began trickling in only in July after the fall of Mosul to the Iraqi government forces, and it was recaptured from the so-called Islamic State. The last 10 months, information was being gathered, especially after ground penetration radar was installed to identify whether these dead bodies were present under a mound in parts of Mosul. And since then, DNA samples were sent from India to Baghdad and they were matched, and 38 Indians were identified, and their bodies have now been brought to India for the first time since they went missing in 2014. But to my mind, the big takeaway, if you ask me, Mohammed, was the fact that Mr. Singh, General Singh, mentioned for the very first time that some or all of these 38 and plus 1, 39 Indians may have traveled to Iraq without valid documentation. Right. In other words, they may have taken the help of an illegal agency, a recruitment agency, to travel to Iraq in the first place, because the Embassy of India in Baghdad had no records of the whereabouts of these Indians who were in Mosul at that time. And that raises 2 pertinent questions, Mohammed. One, that did Indians disregard the travel advisory issued by the government at the time to take precautions and preferably not travel to Iraq or the conflict zones in Iraq? Number one. Number two, looking ahead now, would some Indians still be tempted to travel to Iraq or other countries in the region, conflict zones in the region? And if so, what happens to those Indians then? Right. What can the government do to prevent such a repeat of these incidences going forward? So these are very pertinent questions, which there are no easy answers, Mohammed, but these have to be addressed going forward as well. Absolutely,
indeed. Those are some very interesting questions that have been raised by General VK Singh, where for the very first time that he has admitted that some, or if not all, of these 40 individuals who'd been abducted by the ISIS may have gone into Iraq without valid documents. Daniel, let me bring you in on this. The fact that, the Indian embassy in Iraq had no idea that these 40 individuals were in fact present in Iraq, do you think that may have complicated the search for these 40 missing Indians?
Certainly, yes. Certainly, yes. Of course, if your embassy, whoever you are, have absolutely no details about you when you travel abroad, especially when you travel in a conflict area, it's way more difficult to understand what might have happened to you in case of crisis. So we have to be very clear in saying that, yes, they might have traveled through an illegal agent. This is absolutely not a problem and a responsibility of the 39 Indians. They were moved because of economic necessities. So let's be very careful and be very clear. It's not their fault if they decided to use an illegal agent to travel into another country in order to find a job and send some money back to their families. The problem here is that there are illegal agents who, despite perfectly knowing, because everyone knows that Iraq is a dangerous zone, they traffic illegally laborers, honest laborers from India into a conflict area, endangering their lives, as we have seen, and therefore creating an enormous loss to their families. So to answer the second question that Ramesh cleverly put on the table is, what can the government do? Right. There is a need of a serious crackdown against these illegal agents who are actually taking care of illegal human trafficking, because this is what it is.
Absolutely, indeed. This is, of course, a big issue which has to be addressed by the Indian government. Have to deal with some of these agents who take people by luring them of better opportunities, of jobs in these conflict areas. And these immigrants, when they go there, they're not even registered, or the embassy there, the Indian embassy, would not even be aware. What can the government here do, Ramesh? Is there a plan of action that is being put in place? Has the government said anything on that front? Do we know anything as to what the Indian government is planning to do, because this is not an isolated incident. There have been several other instances which have happened and which continue to happen where people in lieu of jobs are taken to these conflict zones.
Well, Mohammed, while there's no denying that this is a very poignant, very somber moment for the families of those Indians killed in Iraq, but at the same time, there can be no denying that the significance of this event in itself is a learning experience for the government and people of India alike. Now, this is not the first time Indians have been, found themselves in a situation abroad, overseas, be it Iraq before the first Iraq war or the second Iraq war, or even in Lebanon for that matter, or in Yemen, from where government of India sort of brought those Indians in large numbers back to India either by sea or by air. So the question arises as to what can the government do in such situations going forward, especially in conflict areas like in Mosul in Iraq, which was under the control of the so-called Islamic State for nearly 4 years now. So government says it tried everything in its wherewithal to find about the whereabouts of these Indians who went missing in June 2014, mind you. But the information began trickling in only come July last year, when Mosul was liberated from the Islamic State by the Iraqi forces. In the last 10 months, things began to pick up pace, and we saw information coming out in drips and drabs about how these Indians were last traced to Badoosh jail, and they may have been either killed or shot or decapitated by the terrorists, and how their bodies were found under a mound in Iraq.
Right.
So it's only in the last 10 months that information began picking up pace. And as General Singh mentioned, this was a third visit to Iraq in the last 10 months. He first went in July, then in October, and now he returned to India with the mortal remains of the 38 Indians killed in Iraq.
Absolutely, indeed. And Daniel, if I could just come to you for the closing comments, this is a very somber moment. It's difficult to, in fact, even understand as to how the family members at this point of time would be feeling, because they have waited for this moment for almost 4 years now. There is a sense of closure that they would perhaps get with the fact that the bodies have now been brought back. But you've been in these conflict zones before. What do you think, when workers like this get abducted, is there realistically any chance that a government can actually try intervene and try get them back?
There is, Saleh. It depends on the entity with whom you have to negotiate. Unfortunately, terrorist organizations like the Islamic State leaves absolutely no space for negotiations when it comes to these. I think it would have been nearly impossible for any government to negotiate with the Islamic State in order to get back citizens which they abducted. It was maybe possible in the beginning, paying ransoms, but it was very difficult. It's a very, very narrow-minded and violent and brutal organization. It has been done many other times with other organizations, other Salafi jihadi organizations. It was possible to free the hostages. But in that moment, in 2014, the Islamic State was on the upper hand, was a very aggressive, narrow-minded and authoritarian organization. And therefore, it was very, very difficult to negotiate. I frankly don't think it was even possible. And I'm sorry that these 39 Indians, honest, hard-working South Asians, went there to find dignity and a good job, and they met death.
Absolutely, indeed, Daniel. That was very well put. And my colleague Ramesh, you wanted to comment on this.
Yes, very quickly, Mohammed. Now, let's not lose sight of the fact that Indian government did successfully bring back Indian nurses who were working in Iraq at the time. So it's not as if the government ignored the concerns of the Indian community working in Iraq, where they could operate in double quick time. They ensured that they were brought back safely. But in their case, the 39 Indians who perished in Iraq, the government says it did not have any information about their whereabouts. There was no way they could have verified from the employer or any other source on the ground in Iraq all these 4 years, and therefore that compounded matters for the government in this case.
Absolutely, indeed. You're referring to the nurses who were caught up in Tikrit, which the Indian government managed to bring back successfully. Thank you very much indeed to Ramesh Ramachandran and also to Daniel Ipagani, who joined us from Oman. This, of course, is in many ways gives a sense of closure for the family members who've been waiting for their loved ones to return. But also at the same time, this has opened a whole gamut of questions as to what needs to be done when many of these people who want to migrate abroad in lure of jobs, when they're looking for greener pastures, and is to have they're also open to be manipulated and exploited by some of these unscrupulous travel agents who try to take them with the lure of greater pay and make them end up be caught up in a conflict zone which perhaps they had never earlier thought is where they would be heading to.